96. The usual evolution to socialism, corporatism. There probably is a usual evolution to socialism in a society that fails to have a moderate democracy with more or less egalitarianism in distribution of wealth. As wealth becomes concentrated and government heeds the will of the most rich, a state of semi-corporatism prevails. Benefits and pensions are cut to the workers. Corporations invest overseas with cheaper labor costs, and the masses in a formerly democratic and egalitarian society become pacified with bread and circuses, debauchery and scandal. Eventually, the degraded and new proletarian plebeians, with formerly external proletariats invading to join the workforce and keep wages low for the masses as concentrated wealth increase, seek social benefits through government to replace the lost pensions and solid wages of a formerly well-off working and middle class. The insider 1% class strips jobs of meaningful benefits and use unemployment as a lever such that it's better to have a job than not. True. Keep benefits and wages minimal. Hence, socialism arises with socialist leaders joining with corporatists at the apex of government. Individualism is repressed along with creativity. Socialist leaders raise taxes upon concentrated wealth and corporations to replace the tax cuts given by overly exuberant corporatist leaders of previous eras. Corporatist leaders become aware of the planetary trend towards socialism and corporatism and use the leverage of unemployment or inflation to increase their power and break up anti-1% sentiment. The ecosphere declines in health in the meanwhile, and of course the marketplace of ideas is entirely repressed. There would be nothing so dangerous as new intelligent political ideas or intelligent ideas introduced into the political sector. 74. On totalization impacting free will. People already know that freedom expression was shut down. Corporatism tolerates nothing in conflict with corporatist interests predominantly. The recent China NBA issue was a case in point. Corporatism and communism each repressed free speech. The Democrat Party and socialists these days tend to want to force things their way through any means, legal or quasi-legal, at work. Anyone antipathetic may find a kind of hate speech in any language perhaps becoming easier with increasing power. Search engine stuff may be downgraded so nobody finds political posts or posts from a writer who's written politically opposite material, or the writer banned from social media platforms, an employee terminated, a web page closed down. Nothing new in the Milltown, wanting total political control to support their interests. The new thing is that the world is being totalized incidentally through global networking. 75, a note on separation of church and state. When government controls a religion and has a state religion, history shows that it is bad, because wicked people eventually take over governments, even if only for a while. It is better to have a separation of state and church. Adolf Hitler in Germany of the Reich era had an official church, and people like Karl Barth left it or wouldn't join it. Not even Christians agree on correct doctrine, not uncommonly. Imagine President Trump, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, or Bernie Sanders making the theological decisions as leader of the Church of America. State churches aren't good for either Christians or secular citizens. I would say the Church of England is somewhat poor on theology and discipline. England led the way on homosexual marriage, and the Anglican Church of Canada put a heavy price on native Canadian children. With a state church, theological pursuit of truth is limited to what the state wants. The UK has religious pluralism, though it has the Church of England. There are still Catholics and other Protestants. I am not a fan of royalty or authoritarianism. Some people are. The Roman Empire divided with the state church of the Eastern Empire at Constantinople. The schism led to the eventual sacking of Constantinople by Crusaders and the later conquest of Turks and more war. I can easily imagine a different course of development for Christian history under different circumstances. The secular and political condition shouldn't really decide how the Christians form ecclesiastically. I like a priesthood of believers, church structure, rather than a patriarchal structure. If government is able to influence religion, that works badly for the church and freedom in general, even in the secular world. Sin in the world in Europe and North America would emerge as a certain percent of the population, regardless of the relationship of government to the faith community. It was the government, the U.S. Supreme Court, that forced sin on the nation, homosexual marriage, reflecting elite desires for sin and populist sales. 76. Why people are religious. People had fear of the unknown, and rightly so in most cases. Explanations were made to account for things, refer to Big Bang theory. Liege lords demanded allegiance from their peasant serfs, yet God is different from secular loyalty, fealty, and such matters. There were tribal gods, of course, and when different tribal gods appeared in different tribes, that caused issues. Actually, it was challenging to separate the concept of God from tribal approaches to God. The idea of eternal life freed people from the hopelessness of bad political leadership and death. A transcendent God differs quite a bit from the Roman amalgam of gods taken from tribes they conquered. Muhammad's father was keeper of the Kaaba, spirit house at Mecca, with its pantheon of gods. When Muhammad's father lost his job and was kicked out, Muhammad borrowed Christian and Jewish ideas and scripture to write his own transcending approach to God, Allah. Allah was a tribal god without borders, able to lead all of the tribes that joined in. The political approach to religion or allegiance attaches even to secular concepts such as evolution that is an endemic belief of the Democrat Party in the USA. Like Allah, secular atheist evolution runs toward a God without borders approach, politically manifesting in the hatred of traditional American values and border security in favor of globalism. People do learn religious ideas from culture. In the Bible, God says that everyone knows him and that they just forget who he is or repress that sense in the book of Jeremiah. Secular evolutionists like to explain away God through various reductionist strawman associations, and that is good enough to satisfy those that aren't too philosophically inclined. There were a number of arguments in support of the necessity of God, such as the ontological argument, or rather the logical probability of God that can also be improved to support the idea that a supreme being is the source of all that exists. Logical studies for themselves support the plausibility of a supreme being whom is spirit and different from the content of creation. That is, one may use logic and reason to look into the idea that a supreme being created the universe in some way, regardless of disputes that may arise concerning a posteriori hermeneutics or cosmological mechanics in support or opposition. A philosophical approach to consideration of the likelihood of the existence of a supreme being differs significantly from purely tribal approaches to belief in a tribal god. The Japanese Shinto seems reasonable, yet unbelievable to Westerners. The Torii and Kami spirit gates and spirits fluttering about like birds don't seem better than the Romans and local deities such as Janus the door god, whose temple opened only when the Romans went to war. Christians, of course, believe in the person that was Jesus Christ as the Son, member of the Trinity of God and God himself equal to the Father. I think Jesus was the real thing, too. It was lucky that he appeared in history when he did. Christianity is also a transcendent faith, without borders, yet it also instructs Christians to obey secular laws and authorities that don't interfere with Christian faith. So why do some have more religion than others? For the same reasons, I would suppose, as people believe in anything, including science. Personal thought, reliance on authority, prevailing customs. Maybe it is a matter of grace, finally. Some people try to treat all religions as the same in religious belief, too, in order to solve them. One might use biology to solve physics, or geology equally well. When James Peebles won the Nobel for Physics a couple of days ago that showed how much scientists believe in Big Bang Theory, it is a part of secular belief system, yet it could be wrong. That is, there are other ideas that could account for the existence of the physical universe. In the same scientific vein, such as this universe could be the froth around a four-dimensional black hole from a universe with 5 dimensions, etc. A white hole, as it were. 77. Thus spake Zarathustra, what it's about. Thus spake Zarathustra is Nietzsche's worldview as the philosopher of the eternal recurrence. His philosopher named Zarathustra lived on a hill overlooking a city far below. From that homeless guy's tent, I added that, he viewed and considered the morality and social structure of the people in the village. Zarathustra considers the humdrum life of the villagers, whom he regards as mindless sheep going about their social conventional lives like meaningless ants. It takes a village for that. The 19th century was the age of romanticism and idealism. Those were points of view that disdained the social order. Nietzsche had a different point of view. One night, walking along the shore of Lake Geneva, he had a strong sense of déjà vu. He realized for himself that the life, world, and universe had happened before, an infinite number of times, in fact. That enlightenment made him superior to others. He believed the right response for superpersons was an eternally recursive point of view. With an internally recursive point of view was to act like wolves, predators or vampires upon the human species that were not so enlightened, living unreflectively and unaware in their lives in the villages and cities. There are interesting paradoxes in Nietzsche's infinite recursion of everything that exists. For one thing, even the vampire superpersons would be doomed to act as vampire superpersons forever without being able to change anything about their lives. My thought is that Nietzsche's strong mental states were a little traumatizing and introverting. His syphilis may have made him view the universe as recurrent. If life is tough, it may be that deja vu occurs naturally in some circumstances. It could be a kind of self-reflecting cognition of the present that makes it seem infinitely recurring, like when a TV camera is pointed at a camera, giving the illusion of infinite recurrence or recursion. Nietzsche put his point of view in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Perhaps he envisioned himself as being like Zarathustra, a great man founding a religion. Certainly there are lots of syphilitic drug addict followers of Nietzsche today. 78. Physicalism, Information, and Soul. Physicalism is itself a philosophical point of view about the mass and energy in which humans exist and of which the universe is made. It used to be called materialism. People exist within the field that is the universe as it is generally understood. People tend to believe it is made of particles and waves that are energy. The entire structure, from largest to smallest, isn't fully known, though a lot of the things within it are. Some believe God created and sustains the energy field, as it could be all within his thought. Others think it might be a hologram or even pure mathematics at its core, yet one thing can be certain: people experience the universe. Physicalism is also known as material monism. Some people use the concept to distinguish it from real kinds of ghost in the machine theories about spirit. Personally, I believe God needs no extra substance for a soul to be immortal. If a soul is information, God, as an omniscient being, has no loss of information, as if Shannon entropy destroyed his data. Actually, information is thought never to be lost from the universe, even at a black hole. So, with the right information, God can sustain or clone a soul, though each universe is unique in theology, and give it whatever span he chooses. What is information to absolute spirit, one might wonder? Physicalists tend to be monists exclusively, though lacking an overall account of everything that is falsifiable, obviously, and perhaps necessarily. The universe could as well be an idea or a supercomputer simulation. 79. About Jesus and judgment. When Jesus said, "Judge not, lest ye be judged," I had a sense that he was referring to the judiciary or something like it. That is, one could make judgments about people back in the day and act on one's judgment that could be wrong with lynch mobs or stoning and do harm to innocent people. The Lord was then trying to save people rather than someone sitting in judgment over them. Jesus said in John 12:48, "He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day." That is, on Judgment Day, when the living and the dead are brought before God. It is about eternal life, and who goes with the Lord when this mortal experience is at an end. This is an amazing statement. Remember that the Lord's prophecies applied at several levels and times simultaneously, the least of which was not that he would have saved those living in Jerusalem that would reject him, and that not a stone would be left standing in the city. And in 70 AD, Jerusalem was totally destroyed by the Romans, with 1 million Jews killed. Keep in mind the Lord's mission. He said in the book of Luke 35, "But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again, and your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil." 36. Be therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful. Refer to Matthew 7:1-6 and Romans 14:1-12. 37. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together, and running over, that men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye meet withal, it shall be measured to you again. 80. Sartre, Camus, Existentialism, and Marxism. Sartre's major works haven't communism in them. It is a fact that he wrote part of the Critique of Dialectical Reason in the Soviet Union in 1958, I believe it was. Yeah, that work isn't about communism. It is existentialism in a social context. It is a brilliant work. He blew out an eye while writing the 700-plus pages, a dedicated writer. In the critique, Sartre described the way people interact as a bunch of individuals within an existential framework. Later in the 1960s or 70s, he was interviewed in a book titled Between Existentialism and Marxism. In my opinion, Sartre realistically analyzed the continental location of France between the Soviet Union and NATO forces to the west. He had been a prisoner of war in the Second World War. Philosophically, maybe he wasn't for Armageddon on the Seine. He considered the phenomenal and existential situation of France phenomenally, as an existential circumstance. In my opinion, Sartre was the earliest transitional intellectual figure leading post-Stalinist Russia in a new synthetic direction. Sartre never joined the Communist Party, yet he certainly was in bed with them now and then. He seems to want to keep his partisan red street creds, yet I wonder if that wasn't a bit of a Trojan horse that would let him influence East and West alike toward existentialism, phenomenalism, and social self-reflection by the masses such that they would be conscientious and aware they could make society for themselves better. This split with Camus seems by consensus to have been one about means to revolt socialism, violent or nonviolent. Interesting, since Sartre himself is probably the last guy to practice violence. 81, my opinion of Karl Marx's work. I read a couple of Marx's books a long time ago, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. The material was also covered briefly in a sociology course. Karl Marx was a brilliant sociologist, of that there is no question. His analysis and description of the problems England had in his day were on the mark. He understood the problems that England experienced during the Industrial Revolution, when so many peasants were forced off rural land and migrated into London and other cities to work in the factories. The factories had bad working conditions generally. Nowadays in the USA, there is the Federal Office of Safety and Health and several other ways that work conditions are not allowed to be too oppressive and unhealthy, unless one is an illegal alien, I suppose. England had nothing like that, and people worked very long hours, including children and sometimes women. That was what Marx saw and described when he was working at a library in London. Marx, like American revolutionaries, had no care for aristocracy. There were still a lot of royal governments in Europe, so his wish to revolt was unwelcome in the nations he had been kicked out of. Marx was also Jewish, and Jews had been kicked out. Marx and had an identity crisis in Europe in that era, and hoped for a nation of their own to live in, since they were victimized by pogroms in Russia and other countries. Marx had a bifurcated political motive for revolt. I think some Jews, like Trotsky and some of the Jews that were leaders in the German Revolution near the end of the First World War, had a desire to revolt as a substitute for having a Jewish state to move to. Some Jews sought to establish a Jewish state in Europe. Perhaps one can compare their troubles to that of the Kurds. President Trump recently dropped the Kurds cold and was of no help in establishing a Kurdish state. It is a good time to do that, and Turkey and Syria could have been incentivized to give Kurds land in recognition in exchange for 2 times the land they gave Kurds from annexations of Syrian land. That would be heartbroken about the Assad government losing some land. As I understood Marx, he was a great analyst, yet ironically a fairly uncreative economist. When he associates the capitalists with aristocracy as their lapdogs, he might have been a modern talking about the relationship of the broadcast media to the 1% that owns the media. Marx felt that capitalists were the next phase in rich, powerful minorities oppressing the majority. He was right about that, it turned out. And actually, historically, wealth is generally concentrated throughout history, such that 1% of the people have 90% of the wealth. Democracy was supposed to offset that, change it, and it did during the 20th century because of World Wars I and II, which made taxation at a reasonable rate quite practical. I believe the top rate was about 80% on the most rich. And that is fading away very rapidly and has been since 1980. Plainly, Marx was not a good designer of a new economic system to replace the aristocracy and capitalism. That is a problem the Democratic Party has today. They just aren't good at reforming capitalism to make it more egalitarian and to pay off public debt and restore the ecosphere to health. A democracy works best with robust free enterprise enabled through all of the people having adequate startup capital normally. The Communist Manifesto was written by Marx for a fee, yet it was more of a work for hire than a free exposition of his own thought. He wrote it for some communist group, I don't recall the name, the Comintern or something like that, or the First International, and it became popular. So Marx was a good analyst, historian, and sociologist with a misapplication of Hegelian metaphysics in a non-functional economic program. Democracy has all of the tools it needs to raise taxes to a high enough level that wealth and power wouldn't be over-concentrated to the diminution of democracy, which it has done. Democracy is effectively dead, and I suppose because of the sophistication of corporatist internet censorship and downgrading and loss of different opinions in the search engine listings. I think democracy dies without free expression in a marketplace of ideas where the best ideas can actually be promoted to become political platforms. All that's happening is that both parties support the rich, and they move along 2 rails to doom, basically, taking all their limbs with them. Democracy has all of the tools it needs to raise taxes to a high enough level that wealth and power wouldn't be over-concentrated to the diminution of democracy. It could reform capitalism with some regulation to make it serve the people and restore the ecosphere. The trouble is that Democrats aren't too well informed about ecological economics and actually just want to be like Republicans themselves with lots of wealth and adequate decadence and immorality. In a democracy, the people are sovereign rather than a tiny minority, as in aristocracy or plutocracy. The people need to actually use their power to prevent concentration of wealth and power if they want to be sovereign. Certain royals were not reluctant to rule and benefit themselves more than the people. Taxation is a part of government. The people cannot expect government to provide free services. I would look around and see original sin as responsible for social ills rather than forced redistribution, incidentally. Redistributionism is something of an obsolete concept anyway, since capital in many ways isn't easy to redistribute. I am more for changing the way capitalism works and to regulate it so it serves everyone equally well as citizens rather than special interests and those destroying global and national ecospheric health. Communism had to fall. It had to fail. It had a functional economic system for progress. Marx had theories like value added and alienation of labor, obviously, yet those phenomena don't require communism for correction. Marx saw everything that was bad and leaped to the conclusion that it could be fixed in the communist system. Communism works directly against individual initiative and creativity. It doesn't really evolve well so much as to keep everything more like ancient Egypt, unchanging for thousands of years with a few pyramid projects and ruling elites overseeing everything. Capitalism without intelligent regulation is like a plague of locusts consuming the ecospheric health and keeping the locusts enslaved. No system of economics can replace intelligent leadership with good ideas in a democracy. If capitalism is failing now, concentrating wealth and destroying ecospheric health and oppressing ordinary people from free enterprise that isn't networked and owned by the rich, it is because government hasn't good leaders and is unaware of how to lead to reform. 82. About the analytic-synthetic distinction. Analytic truths are self-consistent without reliance on something besides the internal logic for truth. Synthetic propositions involve something outside the statement. They're somewhat more like algebra with variables that can make a statement true or false depending on what they are. So the logic of math may be implicitly true if it isn't false, yet mathematical statements may be analytically false. True math statements require verification or something beyond themselves, for axioms or whatever, at some point need to be accepted as true for the rest of the maths to follow. That premise is why Quine thought the synthetic-analytic distinction wasn't valid, so far as I get from reading the article on the analytic-synthetic distinction. A synthetic proposition that everyone knows is true, such as the Earth has been around a long time, is like a math axiom and just being accepted as true with some verification from experience. The epistemological criterion of the analytic-synthetic distinction is unavoidably challenging, like Descartes' paradigm. From the Meditations on a Method, verification of anything, including experience, originates inwardly and is an association of ideas and percepts with thought. Self-standing truth is God. Everything else requires verification through association. Matthew 27:20-25 and moral responsibility. Essay 83 from For the Love of Wisdom. Matthew 27:20-25 seems like an assumption, a claim of legal and moral responsibility for the execution of Jesus. Though they were a necessary enabling act for the worldly execution, since Pilate was agreeable to letting Jesus go, the Jews had no right to take responsibility, for it was predestined by God. God knew people are doomed to work evil because of original sin. The history of the Jews and the books of the prophets is a great exercise in futility as well as faith. The consequence of the execution could have been said to be the destruction of Jerusalem with 1,000,000 dead that followed in an apocalypse, yet also the Lord's victory over death and actualization of the other prophecies. The Lord was the greatest prophet of the Bible as well as the Son of God. God can sort out the issues of free will and responsibility better than mankind. The end of the old covenant and transition to the new was costly. Redemption of those of faith in the Lord from the criterion of original sin through his atoning sacrifice is the greatest or most meaningful event in history concerning human destiny. Matthew 27:22. Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." 23. Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." 24. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. 25. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. 86. Some worry about human predation as a pack. Predators are often individuals. IMO is a pejorative term, of course. A few prey upon the many. For example, a few lions prey upon hundreds or thousands of ungulates. Some wonder why it is ethical to slaughter animals for food, yet it's not okay to torture domesticated animals, pets. Dogs are humanity's first domesticated breed, and it is bad form to torture one, cutting off a leg or whatever. Torture is wrong in any case. And thus spake Zarathustra, a philosopher living on a hill looking down on a town, regarded everyone as sheep, following along without being awakened. It is an old theme. Nietzsche had syphilis, and it affected his worldview over time. Although it's possible he could have been correct for some and wrong for others, because if the entire universe were already created in the mind of God, predestined, and already existed for all of eternity, then as physicists pointed out, it could be that it's mind that travels through various stages in time in the universe, and the universe itself is rather static. So it would be possible, I would think, that Nietzsche could have been stuck on the ladder of space-time evolution. Everything already exists, and including everything exists, including evolution and Darwin's evolution, on this eternal ladder that already exists. And he experienced recurrently or recursively over and over at a particular spot, perhaps in reality or perhaps not. It might be as if one of the old style record players with vinyl records spinning around. If you got a groove or something scratched the surface of it, the playing needle would stick in that one spot over and over as it cycled around. And maybe Nietzsche experienced something like that, so it wasn't actually a false idea, but it wasn't exactly what he thought it was either. Average people work and follow along without thinking about what an ideal society would be or how to build one, much less test out their theoretical work. Government is an improvement over anarchy. Civil order brings civil education, knowledge, and concatenated generation. All animals consume food. That thermodynamic need is probably what original sin is really about. Adam and Eve were cast down into temporality, birth and death, the need to labor, etc., instead of being something like pure spirit. When Jesus gave his body and blood symbolically at the Last Supper, he apparently was aware of the fallen criterion of mortal being in a universe. Through accepting his sacrificial atonement, one is reconciled unto spirit. Many want to stay mired in the original sin paradigm, though, or don't recognize it. Oh, yes, returning to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, and the idea that if there was an eternal recurrence, it would be appropriate just to become a wolf predator upon the sheep. And the reason why that would be a mistake, too, if the eternal recurrence were just a stuck groove, scratch in the groove of the record LP of the universe, of God's internal construction of a universe that always existed. Because it creates theological issues, such as if everything always existed in the mind of God, and it's all predetermined, and he's omniscient and eternal, then every idea ever had may have already existed before anything was created. But everything always was created. I mean, that is the issue about it. And Tegmark, in his book, A Mathematical Universe, describes, I think it's a level 4 multiverse possibility, that it all exists, pre-exists mathematically in structure in some way. And the mind just moves from each universe and each place automatically every time it has a different thought. And that's quite consistent, in my point of view, with a universe created, a multiverse, whatever, created by God from all of eternity, existing within his own mind constructions in some way. But the people who opt for evil are just still doing evil in God's realm, before God, on God's ladder. And so they've still made a wrong choice. They assume if the universe is recurrent, then God would be absent. But that is totally not a logical inference at all. 87. Is there a doomsday clock for global warming? The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists had published a doomsday clock for nuclear war for decades. The minute hand has been at 2 minutes to midnight for several years, I believe. The trouble with going full tilt for panic too soon is that one can't get closer without resorting to Eleatic micro and picosecond intervals. If people establish a doomsday clock for global warming, it should not be at the panic place initially, give a little space to take note of worsening conditions. About dying for your country and living for others, Essay 88. I think it might be easier to understand in a primitive situation. For example, if a family of humans with small children were walking on the savannah and a lion attacked, should the father not defend his family or just run and let the kids be devoured and the woman? Patriotism depends on the circumstances and the reasons. Some ideals are probably worth defending to the death and others not. It would be better to keep a free society and people free than to fall into slavery. That is a reason why democracy sometimes needs to be defended against oligarchs, plutocrats, communists, and fascists. Wouldn't one rather live in freedom than slavery? On the living for others principle, the Lord pointed out that service for others is a good idea. This world is temporary, and the kingdom of God eternal. If one has faith in that, it makes sense. If one has no faith in it, is altruism, which is okay, or servility or slavishness, that is bad. One last point. Some wit said it is better to let the enemy die for your country. There are just two genders. 89. People that believe there are no genders just don't think very well. Basic sexual gender differentiation is exceedingly simple. There are just two, and versions of incomplete or unhealthy growth, unfortunately. The anomalies are a small fraction of the normal healthy population paradigm. Some vegetarians that have radical anti-meat eating opinions haven't even starved and are clueless about how hard it can be to get a chunk of protein in some ecosystems, or why one needs weapons or traps to do so. Genders are simple and reproduction isn't that complex. With poor intellectual skills, people may have less applied intellect than animals that have no trouble comprehending genders. Supposedly, former Vice President Biden became known for smelling the opposite gender. I suppose, well, actually, he smelled a different race, or generally two. I believe that was the original reference of what he would smell. I suppose one could produce and sell a body spray named Gender with 1 million varieties. Behavior is different than anatomy in biology. Language, too, may mean anything or be encoded to permutate to different meanings in some kind of logical progression. So gender today could mean illegal alien tomorrow, or it could, before New York City banned that word and put a $250,000 fine on the phrase for using it maliciously. 90. White hole froth for a local universe. The Perimeter Institute is an interesting think tank for cosmology-related items. Some of their astrophysicists recently published a paper on the creation of the proximal universe from a white hole. The idea is that instead of a big bang, a star in a universe with a higher dimension collapsed to form a black hole with one extra dimension. The event horizon chaff of that event is the material of this universe that is expanding. Interesting idea that higher dimensional universe force fields could account for some inexplicable things like the expansion of this universe with dark energy and possible dark matter too. Parmenides and Heraclitus thought about such matters. Parmenides in particular anticipated the spinning bucket thought experiment in a sense. Here's the paper and another with a different idea about black holes. arxiv.org/pdf/1309.1487 PDF. I should mention that as a Christian, I haven't a problem with various cosmological theories. The Let There Be Light paradigm covers quite a bit of theoretical spatial configuration. Chaos and transportation systems design. Chaotic systems are perceived. Studies found that initially chaotic systems tend towards self-organization for various reasons, and I would think that one reason, not in the Wiki article, is the underlying pervasive four forces of nature, weak, strong, electromagnetic, and gravity, that affect everything. And then there is the color force. All mass has order from strings of quarks up and occur in definite ways. Large steady-state systems may disorder, and as one said, die, yet that disorder occurs in an ordered context for a larger system containing the micro-disorder. Change in time along thermodynamic lines or disorganized destruction of previous positions. Hilbert space point configurations evolving with time require that what went before no longer exists. The new configurations are made from the chaotic end of the prior. I quite agree that local conditions of chaos and coincidence should be used when opportune for providing efficient use of resources. Transportation is a good example. Local topography and climate considerations and other energy elements could enable select transportation modes that would not be practical elsewhere. However, mass systems design and transportation infrastructure that relies upon power over efficiency, such as fossil fuel vehicles and asphalt concrete highway ports, not only harm the ecosphere, they preclude local adaptations to clean energy and present substantial opportunity costs. Inefficient food production with ecospheric externalities such as growing cattle or slash and burn farming are historical legacies that were not done for any sort of malevolent reasons, as would poisoning people. In the 1920s, there was a fellow that marketed a new beverage in a bottle to the tennis-playing East Coast upper crust. It was named Radithor and used the newly discovered radioactive materials. An article in Scientific American described the incident. The producer thought it was good for people, and of course it wasn't. An autopsy showed that the business guy was a rare individual with bones that could absorb a lot of radiation without much harm. Victims liked the warm glow they got from the drink before their hair fell out. The problem with cattle is the CO2 gas externality, destruction of the wild habitat, not meat eating. Protein has always been mostly good for human consumption, especially in the Arctic regions. Fish even promote brain growth, apparently. 107. Unchanging laws of physics. Physicists generally believe the laws of the universe haven't changed. There was an idea about a possible variable speed of light, yet that was not developed too far. One might want to throw out the word eternal from the cosmological criterion. The universe is believed to have had a beginning at t equals 0 and is now about 13.3 billion years beyond that date. Unless it is an unobservable multiverse, the boundaries could never be observed with the present physics knowledge and tech. So if it has any sort of eternal character about it, that would be in one direction, outward as time and matter run down, unless of course it is an eternally recurrent universe that expands and contracts like a yo-yo, an improbable idea, and it would require constant, never-changing laws ad infinitum. The reason for the assumption that the laws of physics haven't changed since the start of the universe is based on observation of the universe, together with a body of physics knowledge, theory, development, and how that correlates with observation. One need distinguish between the laws of physics that exist in nature and human ideas about what those laws are. Physicists and their theories are fallible. Their ideas evolve over time and usually improve. The universe has a thermodynamic nature. It started highly organized and compact and unwinds to expand in a disorganized form. Initially, there was just one force and field compact, and it expanded and cooled down into 4 primary forces that exist today. At very high temperatures, such as occurred at the start of the universe, the forces unify. There is a multiverse theory wherein each unique universe has its own laws, yet once the universe starts, it irreversibly flows down slopes as if it were unwinding within its particular balance as a physical structure. Physical laws are discovered rather than invented, so it is quite right that the understanding and description of physical laws may change. What does not change in the operating mechanics of any given universe, it is the operating laws of a universe that make it that particular universe. An analogy might be that of a square box with 3 dimensions and 6 sides, including the top and bottom. A box in that universe could not have 10 sides or 2 sides and be a square box. It would be possible to redefine what a side is and say, for example, that all of the sides of the box, excluding the top and bottom, are just one side, ignoring the corners, yet the box that must exist in the universe would be the same box regardless of how it is described. Assume that there is one perfect example box that really exists to describe. In that same universe, a box described as having 6 sides could not be a box described as having 3 sides without either a logic or categorical error inconsistency in the definition of ideas of sides. Descartes' meditations about first principles of thought and certainty epistemology, what is known or knowable, began with self-reflection or thought. Zhuangzi said a famous saying about a man dreaming he is a butterfly and vice versa. The East had several thinkers who consider the possibility that reality is illusory before Descartes. Descartes' main differentiation from his predecessors is in his development of reason as the tool for epistemological investigation and certainty. He wrote the Meditations of a Method while employed as mercenary in Switzerland, where he spent a lot of time inside an oven that was used as a sauna. 39. Determinism and modal universe logic. Modal logic can entertain an infinite number of universes within any kind of self-consistent premises within them, I guess. Yet logical structures may not be all that exists or could exist with actual universes, since logic is a kind of structure itself, unlike illogical structures that may exist. If sound has structure, alternatively, it may not have recombinatory logic, although echoes can be logically extrapolated from a sound source, and light waves may alter with blue and red shift, characteristics consistent locally with their structure and that of the medium they travel in. The unknown, like dark energy, cannot readily be given logical context except in observation and comparison to known structures. One must assume a given character or modal structure for any universe that one would make behavioral predictions about. Some simple predictions of deterministic behavior can be made upon prior decisions a person has made, with the free will of the individual being consistent with predictions about his determined behavior. His free will has bound him to predictability like a chess player with a known kind of game. It is also possible to make predictions early in life about babies' behaviors, for example, concerning basic material needs. A baby has free will, yet its behavior is deterministic to adult others. Various stages in life's way are more difficult to predict concerning an individual's behavior, of course, yet to someone smart enough, it isn't difficult. Just know, for example, a vote of 2 articles of impeachment of the president was completely partisan, with no Republicans voting for and just 2 or 3 Democrats voting against. That was predetermined and easy for even dummies to predict, yet the politicians are said to have free will. I will cut this reply short, for I have other things to move on to. There are numerous approaches to considering the theory of determinism, though one may study it for years. Propositions that can't be falsified, such as true foreknowledge in a superreal context, can have speculative answers. Tegmark's mathematical universe had decisions people make it at a level 4 or 5 multiverse, switching them to an appropriate universe consistent with the decision. In other words, Vincent would make all possible choices and gradations of a choice, and a universe would exist with the consequences of that choice where his mind would go. The idea was that all possible universes actually exist, and it is said that thought switches seamlessly to an appropriate universe. One wonders then if he has free will, or if free will is consistent with just making choices in universes that all fit whatever choice he makes. So the choices are meaningless in a sense. They're meaningful yet meaningless at the same time. Sailors know about the petty relativity of real wind speed versus apparent wind speed, and time has a comparative illusory nature in that it seems to exist as does motion, yet in actuality every possible event in the history of every universe always exists a priori, and conscious minds journey through each with a succession of self-bodies at the right stage and the right condition to perceive the journeying mind. God, I suppose, created the infinite multiverse and knows the disposition of each as he views the past, present, and future of everything, as if it were a museum established for eternity. Perhaps it is in his mind, after all, that anything exists. Perhaps the multiverse, in that context, would be like dreams and memories stored in the mind, and dreams would take almost every possible form based on the real memories. I'm not saying here that life is like a dream or a rowboat. 40. A question about God's trans-infinite power. Someone asked if God has trans-infinite power. I replied, if the question refers to Gregory Cantor's trans-finite infinities, whereas some infinities are greater than others, the obvious answer is that God is greater than all else. One would be aware that God is the issuer of all that exists, including infinities of any stature. Infinity for God would be contingent, or a contingent state of relations. Infinity, one might recall, is generally taken to be a mathematical term, an abstract idea, rather than a physical extent or even a physical construct of infinite scale. One could consider Plotinus's Enneads, 54 tractates, and regard infinity as a condition of a form rather than some physical thing of a lower order. That is a kind of a fascinating, mildly, topic. Is a pure idea infinite? Probably not, except the ideas that are God's. Are all ideas created by God infinite, a priori as a genre? Could ideas of God be categorizable as either finite or infinite? Probably not, IMO. If the intelligence of Plotinus's Enneads is equivalent to the Word of God in the Bible, are forms made or actualized by the intelligence infinite? And I should mention that Plotinus wrote his Enneads in the 3rd century AD, after the gospel of Jesus Christ already existed. One may wonder if ideas that are infinite could be considered at all. For the comprehension to know the idea would need be a greater than the particular infinite nature or structure of the idea. Power that is infinite is transfinite. When learning about Cantor, it is easy initially to write transfinite instead of the accurate transfinite infinities. It is possible to regard nothingness theoretically as the greatest physical actualizable infinity. That also seems implicitly self-contradictory. The total mass energy of the universe issued from a Big Bang or inflation would be finite. The total energy of an infinite multiverse would be a finite mass, forever extending perhaps with fuel from a pre-existing field of virtual energy that may be finite, or a priori infinite. If that monistic field has always existed without any time equal alpha, that just is unsatisfyingly improbable. It is simpler to regard God as Alpha and Omega, pre-existing any actualized field, who created the initial field that supported the growth of multiverse. I suppose one could say in that context that God has transfinite power. What is nothingness anyway? There are at least two paradigms of nothingness. One is that of naive physics, meaning absolute vacuum of space, and that may not exist. That is taken to mean physical nothingness, or the absence of anything existent at all with pure space where nothing is. Nothingness would perhaps be refuted as infinite by something or being existing anywhere and displacing it. However, if being and nothingness are each infinite, one could use them as examples of Cantor's transfinite infinity. This second meaning, and which would be greater, being or nothingness? I would go with the being rather than nothing. The second meaning is that of Jean-Paul Sartre, wherein nothingness is an absence of being or presentness rather than meaning empty space. In his book, Being and Nothingness, he used an example of the absence of a waiter in a restaurant named Pierre as an example of nothingness. In other words, nothingness is more than a memory of someone being gone. It is a change in the present array of physical being. So the past may be said to be nothingness in that it no longer exists as it was. Even Mount Everest is not the same way exactly as it was a few thousand years ago. You can never climb the same Mount Everest twice. Therefore, space-type nothingness does not exist. It is just the condition of sparse being with virtual particles and other unknown content comprising it, the transformations of form of a universe or multiverse primordial field of solid state. Decoherent physical being is the source of comments about nothingness existing. Change has converted what was into a state of non-being. And yet, I should make the point that being cannot exist without nothingness, even if it's just spatially. Although it is interesting to consider quantum mechanics without the existence of nothingness in it, and such that the spaces between quarks and any kind of gaps are illusory and assumed by experimental physicists that may not actually exist at all. 41. The Lord and Melchizedek. In the Christmas season, it is good to reflect on Hebrews 7, wherein the Apostle Paul relates the history and version and person of the king of Salem, Melchizedek. One knows the Lord's birth is celebrated on December 25, and that he was born of a woman, Mary. Abraham's encounter with Melchizedek provides an insight into the eternal nature of Christ. Hebrews 7, King James Version. 7. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. 2. To whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. First being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of peace, which is king of peace. 3. Without father, or without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. And I'll omit mention. Now consider how great this man was, and to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoil. And verily they that are sons of Levi will receive tithes. The priests that have a commandment to take tithes of the people of their brethren. But he whose descent is not counted will receive tithes of Abraham, who blessed him that had tithes. And without all contradiction, the less the blessed is better. And here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them with whom it is witnessed that he liveth. And as I may so say, Levi also, who received tithes, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for whom if the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident, for that after the similitude of Melchizedek there ariseth another priest, who is made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. For he testifieth, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For there is verily a disannulling of the commandment, going before for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by the which we draw nigh unto God. And inasmuch as not without an oath he was made priest. For those priests were made without an oath, but this with an oath, by him that said unto him, The Lord swear and will not repent, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. By so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. And they truly were made